Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome to the fifth session of the webinar series, Dissecting Capitalism, its Past, Present, and Future. This series aims to explore the tenets of capitalism over the fabric of time and examine its influence on the global economy and social classes. Today's session is titled, The Law is an Anagram of Wealth. This session, whose title is shared with the 1993 Anne Clark record of the same name, will focus on the relationship between land uses, land values, and land law. And who better can speak on this topic than the author of Essential Injustice and Land Policy? We do have an absolutely talented professor to speak on this topic, and I would now call upon Satvik to introduce this wonderful professor.
All right, I think Satvik. All right, Satvik has handed
Oh my
over
God,
to me.
I'm so sorry.
No, it was supposed to be Anisha. Please go ahead, Anisha.
It's all right.
Absolutely
It's all right.
sorry, Anisha.
That's perfectly okay. I think we have been very happy to have Professor Davy with us for the second time on the YSS South Asia Working Group. It's a pleasure and a joy to have you again with us, Professor. Introducing our speaker of today, Benjamin Davy is visiting professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Johannesburg, and at the School of Architecture and Spatial Planning, TU, Wien University. He was professor of land policy, land management, and municipal geo-information at the School of Spatial Planning, TU Dortmund University. Welcome, Professor, again, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I will start with my show. The law is an anagram of wealth. That is the title of a record by Anne Clark, and I always loved that title a lot. Not so much the record, I have to say. It's a little bit too indie for me, but the law is an anagram of wealth means that you can toy around with the letters you need to for the phrase the law, and then it turns into wealth, or the other way around. But it's also more than that. It sort of expresses the idea that wealth and the law are closely interrelated and connected. And this is what I want to talk about today. On Charles Bridge, I took that photograph. Charles Bridge is in Prague. It's a very famous bridge that was built in the 15th century. Prague was where in the 17th century, the 30 Years' War commenced. Wealth is not the fruit of labor, says Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth. Wealth is not the fruit of labor, but the result of organized, protected robbery. European cities are cities built with the blood money from feudalism, colonialism, slavery, and warmongering. And I would like to start by investigating how economic orthodoxy explained the organized, protected robbery. The first one, of course, is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith explained private property as a natural right. The property which every man has in his own labor, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable. The patrimony of the poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his hands, and to hinder him from employing his strength and dexterity in what manner he thinks proper without injury to his neighbor is a plain violation of this most sacred property. So the first step in the organized robbery is to invent an instrument and call it sacred. property as a natural right. And really, if you think of a poor man who, with his own hands, labors, creates something, who could deny that poor man the right to own the fruit of his labor? And behind that, you, of course, hear John Locke speaking. But property isn't just for poor people. And then the idea of a sacred right becomes really dangerous for everybody with no or only little property. So the next step is the legal fiction described by Karl Marx. And I hope you see that property and economics isn't just something invented in the 20th century, but that you can, if you look at the classic texts, go back quite a while and see that there always have been observations about the relationships between economic values and the legal system. Karl Marx, I'm quoting Capital, Volume 3. The appropriation of rent is the economic form in which landed property is realized. Ground rent, in turn, presupposes landed property, the ownership of particular bits of the globe by certain individuals. Rent is the economic realization of landed property, the legal fiction by virtue of which various individuals have exclusive possession of particular parts of the globe. So part of this systematic organized robbery is the parcelization of land and the designation of landowners and land ownership. There is nothing which so generally strikes the imagination and engages the affections of mankind as the right of property. Sir William Blackstone, he really had a wonderful writing style. And in the commentaries on the laws of England, one of the very few textbooks trying to capture what common law really says, Blackstone speaks of property as an object of imagination and affectation, or that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe. Blackstone himself didn't really believe in total exclusion. And if you continue reading that chapter, you will see that Blackstone also spoke about common property and that he was well aware that no landowner really can totally exclude others. There's the law of nuisance, making sure that landowners do not harm their neighbors. But whenever Blackstone is quoted, and he is quoted quite frequently, people often focus on the idea of total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe. And so emerges rent, the form of wealth produced by using land. Rent is the proportion of the produce, writes David Ricardo, of the earth, which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. So we now have looked at Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Sir William Blackstone, and now David Ricardo, the classic economists, and they all agree that there is a connection between land, wealth, and the law. Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation, found a very nice way to describe the relationship with land. What we call land is an element of nature inextricably interwoven with man's institutions. To isolate it and form a market out of it was perhaps the weirdest of all undertakings of our ancestors. So this is in a way the essence of the relationship between the law and wealth. With regard to land, the law turns land into a commodity, into something that can be bought and sold in the market. But still, it is an element of nature. Hans Bernoulli was an architect. He lived in Basel in Switzerland, and in his book Die Stadt und ihr Boden, Land and the City, Bernoulli described a very interesting land reform concept. I will not go into that land reform concept, but in preparing for presenting this land reform concept, Bernoulli analyzed the way land is significant in the city. And he distinguished between two types of land. A private landholder enjoys the land annuity. What looks like a piss pot here, that is the rent that comes out of the private land. The unfertile land occupied by roads and public grounds remains in municipal hands. I think that Bernoulli is adorable also because of using these pictograms and these little drawings as an architect. He was prone to express himself with visual help, and I think that is quite impressive. So what Bernoulli really emphasized is that city land is not homogeneous, that there are different types of city land. And he distinguished two types, private land and public land. Land owned by private landholders and land owned by the public. Commons is a general term for that type of land. Where I think he made a mistake is that he thought only private land produces wealth. Obviously, private property assigns exclusive use rights and creates private wealth. So with regard to private property, he was right. That is the way the law helps creating private wealth. But with regard to the commons, common property assigns shared use rights. And by doing that, common property creates public wealth. Although nobody has to pay for using this wonderful piece of land, it's Parker's Piece in Cambridge, United Kingdom, this is obviously a form of public wealth. And cities combine private wealth production with the production of public wealth. And that is an important insight that not all economic theorists have been able to make. So this is where my little journey into economics turns into a journey into land law and land policy, and of course, spatial planning. Who decides whether to promote private or common property, whether to create private or public wealth? Let me give you an example. Property, says Joan Robinson, property in the right to exploit territory is the archetypal form of property. the whole structure of a society is affected by the rules of the game in respect to land tenure and inheritance. I found that phrase, rules of the game, very inspiring. And it really, although it is a very serious example, if you look at the history of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, it was like a game. It was a game with different stakeholders and different players and different moves that resulted in the development of about 19 hectares of prime urban land in the middle of Berlin, south of the Brandenburg Gate, north of the Sony Center. This is what you see in the back. This memorial by Peter Eisenman was an effort of the reunited Federal Republic of Germany to make visible the deep guilt over the murder of Jews of Europe by the Nazis. Why is that an interesting example of land policy? Well, it's an interesting example of land policy because Germany, the city of Berlin, as well as the federal government, did not with the land what is usually done. Developed as urban commercial land or for urban housing. There's a huge housing crisis in Berlin. So lots of homes could have been developed on these 19,000 square meters. If we look at the land value, and that's a land value map, then I hope you can see my cursor here. This is the site of the memorial. These red lines are the boundaries of land value zones, and the values that you can see, 12,000, for example, here, refers to all land that is designated as building land. Of course, the memorial site is not designated as building land. The exchange value is actually 0. But let's look around. It's 0 because nobody could build any longer anything on the site of the memorial of the murdered Jews of Europe. But what would have been possible? So here we have the Brandenburg Gate, 60,000 euros per square meter. Unter den Linden, 14,000. Or Potsdamer Platz, that's here, 20,000. And the arrow indicates the point of view when I took the photograph. The decision for this memorial was taken by the Federal Parliament in 1999, and it took until 2005 before the memorial was inaugurated. In 2002, I checked the land values. That was quite difficult because at that time Berlin did not publish the land values, the Bodenrichtwerte, the standardized land values in the internet, but I sort of found out that on Potsdamer Platz, it was 7,200 euro per square meter, and unter den Linden, it was 18,000 square meter. And in 2021, unter den Linden was 14,000, Pariser Platz, this is Brandenburg Gate, it was 60,000, and Potsdamer Platz, it was 20,000 euro per square meter. So if you use these values to calculate the cost of the memorial. What did the city of Berlin and the federal government invest? It is somewhere between 228 and 1,140 million euros. And that is what in economic terms have been destroyed by the decision to put the memorial at this location. Land policy and planning play around with property relations. Land policy and planning modify land values. Property defines the rules of the land use game, just as Joan Robinson said, and land policy and planning are the game. So if we look at the multitude of possible land uses, what we can see without great difficulty is that it's not about two types of land uses, private land and public land. There are so many different uses. And I'm turning to Mary Douglas's grid group cultural theory to find a way to map these different land uses, which are always associated with different property rules and with different types of wealth. Mary Douglas's theory explains social situations as the result of plural rationalities. A rationality combines the acceptance of or defiance to external determination. This dimension is called grid, and the proximity to or distance from a collective. And this dimension is called group. So a cultural theory map usually looks like that. High grid emphasizes external determination and low grid emphasizes self-determination. High group emphasizes proximity to a collective and low group emphasizes distance from a collective. And then you get these four different rationality: the hierarchists, the egalitarians, the individualists, and the fatalists. The hierarchists pursue the myth of control. They believe in the rationality of experts. The egalitarians pursue the myth of community, and their rationality is based on trust and distrust, inclusion and exclusion. Individualists pursue the myth of competition, and they believe in the rationality of liberty. And fatalists, well, fatalists pursue nothing, but theirs is the myth of serenity, and their rationality is indifference. If we cross these four types of cultural theory with Bernoulli's two types of property, we look at private property where users have the right to exclude, and common property where users do not have the right to exclude others. So private property restricts the use rights in land to an individual by herself, and common property assigns shared use rights in land to members of a community or the general public. And if we combine restricted land uses established by private property and shared land uses established by common property with the four types of cultural theory, we get 8 types of land uses. The types for restricted land uses are called insular uses, kinship uses, corporate uses, and container uses. And the types of shared land uses I call opportunistic uses, collaborative uses, structural uses, and environmental uses. And each of these types, and this is table 16 from my book Land Policy, has a certain characteristic. For example, insular uses. Property protects the owner from trespass and preserves exchange value. Or let's look at structural uses. Property, actually looking at such a table, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Let's look at some pictures here. So that is a nice example of an insular use. A detached single-family house in France close to the Swiss border. This is established by private property, and land use choices are restricted to the owner of this property. The land use rationality is individualistic. But not all restricted uses are like that. Think of this market, Mahane Yehuda in West Jerusalem. Of course, each vendor has their own cash box and runs their own business, is not a shared use. But the different vendors are in this one place, in this location, in this market, because they know that this will attract passengers, this will attract shoppers, and everybody on Friday before Sabbath starts, flows to Mehane Yehuda in West Jerusalem, and they are doing their kosher shopping. And these are kinship uses. So everyone is connected with others in a way that they depend on the presence of others. But everybody has a restricted business. They have their own cash box, and they take the risk of running their own business. The land use rationality is egalitarian, but it's a type of private property, but not like the insular use, the detached single house. Oh, this is one of my favorite, but it's of course very symbolistic. But all the Indians present will understand why this Amul girl represents the headquarter of the largest food corporation in India. The headquarters of Amul in Anand, Gujarat, that is a hierarchist rationality. It starts on the bottom with a cow and very often a woman. And then the woman gets the milk from the cow and takes it to a collection center. And in the collection center, the milk from many cows are collected and then is brought to another collection center, a more central one. And like a pyramid of collection center, the milk finally winds up in Anand, Gujarat, at the headquarters of Amul. And each land use belonging to that hierarchy only makes sense because there are other land uses to which all of these land uses are connected. Private property, but following a hierarchist rationality. And the fourth type of a restricted land use is this housing estate. Hundreds and hundreds of apartments in Dortmund, Dorstfeld. The estate is called Hannibal. And you can only use this if you are very fatalistic about who your neighbors are. You have absolutely no influence. It's a container. It's like a prison, a hotel, or a cemetery, a container where you do not have any influence on who else is using it. And you just have to bear that. So that were the four restricted land uses based on private property. And let's now proceed to the shared land uses, where land use choices are shared by many. For example, this rickshaw wallah in Dhaka, Bangladesh, does not have to coordinate with anybody when he may use his rickshaw on that street, but it's just an opportunistic use. Opportunistic uses are shared uses where the individualist rationality prevails. It's a form of common property where you do not need to share values with others. You just have to stick to the traffic regulations, of course, but apart from that, you're your own lord. This is an example of a collaborative use that follows the egalitarian rationality. I took that picture in rural Rajasthan, and this is a community center of an irrigation cooperative. And the mural on the wall of this irrigation cooperative tells the story of wells, digging wells to fetch groundwater. And if everybody pursues an individualistic rationality, behaves like the insular landowner from the first land use type, then the groundwater will lower the groundwater level will disappear into the earth, and only the one with the longest pipe will be able to fetch water still, but everybody else as well will be dry. So in order to prevent that, you need to use the land collaboratively, and you need to raise forests again, because the roots of the trees can suck up the groundwater and raise the groundwater level. And the Federation of Environmental Safety in India is a great organization, and they are doing just that. They help organize the irrigation cooperative. The land is used collaboratively within these cooperatives. And that is an example of a structural use. Of course, the paradigm of structural use is the public street that we saw in the drawing by Hans Bernoulli. But this emergency box, I think, is a more sophisticated example of a structural use. It sits there on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. But it only makes sense if we imagine that this is connected to the next police station, and the next police station is part of a hierarchy of police departments all over the city of New York. And that makes it a structural use that only makes sense if you look behind the emergency box and see the hierarchy of land uses that connect different locations with one purpose. The purpose is, of course, safety in a very large city. And my final type of shared land use is environmental use. The environment is, to me, in this context, the archetype of fatalism, because everybody else wants to impress their meaning on the environment. Some consider the environment as a commodity, others consider it as natural beauty, others consider it as capability, but the environment is just there. And I was watching birds and thought, this is a great example of a fatalist type of common property use. And if we go back to the cultural theory map of Mary Douglas, we can put all these different types of shared and restricted uses on the map. So that is the map of the restricted uses, and you have the insular use, the corporate use, the kinship use, and the container use. And the same works for mapping shared land uses based on common property. Here you have the opportunistic land use, the fatalistic, the environmental use, the structural land use, and the collaborative land use. The idiosyncrasies of other voices, other rationalities are not arbitrary. Control and experts, liberty and competition, community and trust or distrust, and serenity and indifference are elements of private and common property rules that are responsive to plural rationalities and create plural wells. My PowerPoint didn't like that I used the word wells, but yeah, there are different kinds of wells. And you know, of course, from environmental economics that it took ages to understand that the environment and nature are not just without price and therefore without value, but that there is something like the intrinsic value of the environment and of nature. And actually, with all of these 8 land use types, a little bit different kind of wealth is associated. And I think it's quite important if we want to think about the speciality of economics. I mean that economic behavior happens in space. If we think about the spatiality of economics, we want to look at these different types of land uses and find out how they are related. I will probably not go very deep into that table, but I would like to give 2 examples that each of these 8 uses needs a different property regime. So insular uses require property rules which support autonomy, but also limit harm to adjacent land uses. Or structural uses, the emergency box, or water pipes, require property rules which give suppliers comprehensive control, but puts them under a common carrier rule. So one of the takeaway points from this talk is that property has a spatial component that is often ignored in economics. And it is important to be aware of the spatiality of property if you want to do serious work in urban economics, for example. The theory of polyrationality takes cultural pluralism seriously, yet in a playful manner. I'm quoting myself here. I call this playfulness the essence of spatial planning and policymaking without a condom, weak polyrationality. Peter Bruegel the Elder produced wonderful pictures of polyrational land uses. This one is from the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, and it's called Children's Play. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, so now we will open the question answer session. If you have any question, please raise your hand or you can type here also. So before anyone asks a question, I can shoot a warm-up question maybe, just to give other chance. So my question, Ben, is why economists, you have touched upon it, but why economists or economics as a discipline should bother about polyrational land values or polyrational property use, property rights? Why should we care? Are we not satisfied with private property-based economic system?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that I would go one step back, I would say first and foremost that economics should deal much more with space and understand space. In many ways, economics still lives in the Thünenwelt, where you have this uniform sort of land that does not make any difference, and very low transport costs make it possible to do business all over the world. Unless there's COVID-19, then suddenly all the value chains break down, and you understand that, oh yeah, economics happen in space, and that has a great influence on how we can perform. And if economists start looking at spatiality, then I think your question makes more sense. They should then consider polyrationality, because land uses are exercised. Land is used from the perspective of different rationalities, and it really depends on the land use. The rules that are good for your home are not the same rules for using the public street. And this is a very general way to characterize the potential of huge difference in details between a variety of land uses. I've presented 8 types of land uses. Maybe you could distinguish 80 or 800. I thought 8 is enough for this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Ben. There is one question already. My read, I'm sorry, please excuse my pronunciation. I'm pronouncing it as a my read, but if you'd like to ask the question by yourself, please turn off your audio and ask yourself.
And it would be great if you can turn on your
Yes.
you video.
Hi, yeah.
Hey, hi.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm new to this, and I'm just curious if there are examples of, like, is the idea of owning land and having rentable land, is it European only in origin? Yeah. So.
Thank you very much for that question. There is a wonderful book by Friedrich Engels who looked at the origins of property, and who was also doing a little bit of anthropological work. And there are other anthropologists who have been looking at how does the relationship between people and the land work in different cultures. Quite right. The idea of private property is a very Western idea. I quoted one source of origin, Sir William Blackstone. He is very often quoted to demonstrate that private property in land has an origin in common law. If you look at indigenous land rights, you will see that quite often, I mean, I'm saying it a little bit more emphasized than I probably should do it, but that indigenous land systems often emphasize that people do not own the land, but the land owns the people. So, for example, in Aboriginal culture in Australia, you will see that many ideas refer to the land as not just soil and dirt, but the ancestors. And the river is an ancestor snake, and the mountain is an ancestor animal. So that, I think, is nicely expressed by Polanyi when he says that this is really very weird to combine nature with human institutions and to create a market. And I think it is a very Western idea, at least in the way property rights are established and exercised in many places of the world today.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Thank
Merit, if you have any follow-up question, you can ask, or I will go to the next one. Okay, so Mr. Maxwell, you raised your hand and now I can't see it. So if you want to turn on your video or audio and ask Okra Maxwell. No? Okay, so there's another question typed here in the chat. So if you want to ask Evangelia, if you would like to ask by yourself.
Hello.
Oh, Mr.
Hello.
Maxwell. Yes, please ask your question.
Okay, sorry, Evangelia.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, dear Professor Davy. I would like to ask you whether I do have your book, but I'm not sure that I have found a different terminology that you use about land use policy or land policy. So taking advantage of this lecture, I would like to ask you whether you have in your mind a different kind of conceptualization and terminology about land policy and land use policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. In my book, Land Policy, I'm not making that distinction. To me, land policy is the sum of whatever public policy makers are doing with regard to land uses. And I appreciate that it is totally legitimate to distinguish more deeper or to define different forms, different types of land policy / land use policy, but I haven't done that.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Because I saw in this presentation that you used mostly land uses, this term. And
it's funny that you notice that, because this is a recent development. I'm teaching an online seminar called Land Use Ethics, and I've called it Land Use Ethics to distinguish myself from Aldo Leopold's land ethic. But now that I've done that, I'm starting to do that also when I'm doing something on land policy. So that is very perceptive, actually. Thank you for noticing that.
Okay, and in which page is this table 22? Because I'm trying to find it in your book, but I can't find it, and probably
there is a list of tables in the beginning of the book, and there you will find the page number.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Natasha.
I believe Mr. Maxwell is here. I think we can pass it over to him.
Yeah.
Okay, please ask.
I was having connectivity network problem. Hello. I want to take this opportunity to thank Ben for this wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome.
I heard something about limited attention from economics or issues of speciality of property. Economics pay limited attention about the speciality of property.
Okay.
I don't know whether I'm quoting you, I'm getting you right.
Correct.
If it is right, as young researchers and economists, what else can we do to place speciality at the center of property?
It is a very good question, and I thank you. I think that before I respond, I would have to make a big exception. I was giving a very tall assessment of economics, and that is of course not correct. Paul Krugman, for example, got the Nobel Prize for his economic model, which is deeply embedded in spatiality and spatial aspects. There is a huge part of the economic literature on property rights and on law and economics, where many very interesting investigations of spatial problems can be found. Still, my impression is that much of mainstream economics still is owing to the neoclassical model, and the neoclassical model is an aspatial model that does not really use space. If you want to engage with space and economics, I would actually recommend the work of William Alonso and of Paul Krugman as a starting point, and take it from there.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Cedric,
So now,
I cannot really follow the chat any longer. Can you?
Okay, so now, yes, now Natasha is going to, if you would like to ask by yourself, or I will read it out. Natasha, please. No? Okay, I will ask. So basically the question you pose, I'm reading it out. If I understand it correctly, do we have the right to privatize and change the basic value of nature?
That is a very nice question. And the short answer is territorial sovereignty in international law is considered as the right of the sovereign of each country to make exactly that determination. So part of the international law concept of territorial sovereignty is that regarding the territory, the sovereign has the right to make all rights and obligations available regarding the land that the sovereign deems fit. Having said that, and referring to my online seminar on land use ethics, I would, of course, say, is that really true? Eldo Leopold would claim that we should not consider ourselves as the conqueror of the land community, but as a member of the land community, and as a member of the land community, so to speak, as guests on the land, we do not have a legitimate right to turn land into parcels of private commodity. And that creates a tension. Obviously, if you read the newspaper, people are more concerned with territorial sovereignty than with ethical land uses. But let me tell you, this has consequences. Climate change, COVID-19, the destruction of the planet are all a result of an unethical, arrogant overuse of territorial sovereignty. People could have been, parliaments could have created a much wiser system of land rights all over the world, but they didn't.
Very well. So it's a very okay. So next question, Andrew. Would you like
Cedric,
to ask?
it must be so difficult for you not to make comments all the while.
Yes, I am the organizer, so I'm ethically obliged not to ask question. Andrew, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for another interesting talk. And I'm always interested in the relationship between, you know, who creates value and who enjoys that value or who keeps the value. And I've given the example of a house next to a public park, and that will have a higher value because of the location of the park, and the park has obviously been put there by the community or by a public authority. Could you say more about how that value should be shared, whether the private owner of the house has an obligation to the public authority to share that value? How could that be achieved?
Thank you very much for that question. And I believe that this is a question that must be answered differently in different legal systems. Let me briefly describe the German situation. In Germany, there has been made a decision that most of the amenities that are produced through public land uses, like the park you've been mentioning, flow to the private owner at no individual cost at all. There are very few moments where land value increases are captured. And that, I think, is a decision that's based on the one hand on the rather strict and comprehensive income tax system. So the policymakers believe that the money should come from raising taxes and not from asking fees for favorable land influences. But it is also coming from the idea that the government would have to compensate owners for unfavorable land uses in their vicinity. Once we start to go down the road that adjacent land uses can increase but also dampen the value of private land, we have to have a real big compensatory scheme in place, and that is quite costly. And I believe that that is also one of the reasons why this isn't done in Germany. In the United Kingdom, as you know much better than me, the notion of planning gain allows in certain situations to capture some of the value that is created through development advantages. But I do believe that proximity to a public park is not something you can capture as planning gain. That's it.
Yes, okay, Andrew is satisfied, it seems, or partly satisfied. So
Andrew is only always partly satisfied, but that is why I love him so much. He's so challenging.
Brishti, if you would like to ask your question, you can ask by yourself. Otherwise, I will read it out. Brishti.
Yes. Hi. So my question is, hello. My question is, when you spoke about the polyrationality and the different combination, how just trying to understand that it can be situational and also it can vary. Like my perception of a particular combination can be, and somebody else's perception can be different, right? And it can contradict. So in that situation, how do we understand how such a like a model plays out, or what are the challenges or limitations? And also I would say that, like, for example, state has different perception, a private party has different perception, and say if there is an informal settlement on a private land, they have different perception and claim over the property. So how do we understand that when we look at like real scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. That is also a great question. The differences in perception can range from a cause of cruel violence to, well, I'm just shrugging, oh, this person regards that land in a different way than I do. So to have different perceptions can cause great conflict, but also it can be just an ordinary urban experience, and you can shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, different people see stuff differently. For planners, for urban planners, it is, and that's the first step, very important to identify different perceptions. How do people perceive land differently? As planners expect that this happens, but that does not mean that they fully understand what types of different perceptions are actually around and how can they be understood. It is truly important, and that is actually what the theory of polyrationality is all about, to make sure that opportunities for the reconciliation or for the cooperation between different rationalities are used and not blocked, so that it is possible to understand that for one person this is a public park, and for another person this is where they sleep at night. And if you are accepting that, and informality in India or in South Africa or in Latin America, that is a typical, that is a very interesting field, if I may say that, from the perspective of land policy, to see how different types of informality deal with these problems. And informal settlements in the Chinese urban villages are totally different from the informal villages in India, and again are totally different from the I'm sorry, I'm missing a word here, from the South African townships, that was the word, which only look informal to a tourist, but are not informal at all, but the result of a very cruel apartheid policy. So I think that informality is not something that was on the top of what I have presented, but from work I've done, I know that informality does not mean lawlessness, but often means different laws and different rules and regulations. And it's important to find out what these rules and regulations are. The first time I've encountered informal land uses was in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and there are very strict systems of how should I put it? It's maybe exploitation is not the best way to put it, but there is a fair extent of violence in place, and people residing in these informal settlements pay a lot of money to the private owner, who only to some extent is the a victim of land occupation, but in fact it is a big business. And if you start understanding that, I think the next step is to explore with each instance of so-called informal land uses, what are the rules behind that? Even if it looks chaotic, it very often is not chaotic at all. I hope, Prishti, that I could respond to your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so we move to our next question. Himanshu Butte, he asked a two-part of question. One is, why do you think economics does not take speciality on board centrally? What is at stake there? I mean, why really they don't care? And the second question is, how does the emergence of land as property relate to any changes that might have happened to the understanding of territory in Europe? It's a
Wow. Wow.
Okay.
Wow. Great questions. Let me start with A. My understanding is that the neoclassical setting up of an economic analysis looks at the firm and the household and looks at what the firm and the household can produce or consume and what is needed in this process. And land is just an input there. And it's not necessarily the most exciting input because it is there. And you are more interested in watching out, how do the prices for raw materials change? How does labor, the price of labor change? And that occupies the attention of economic analysts. Whereas the land, well, it's just there. Probably the firm has invested a lot of money in buying the land, or they are renting it, and it's not really a difficult thing because enough is available, and if not special situations arise, it's not really interesting for that sort of cost-benefit analysis. I believe that this is the reason that land is very often overlooked in the economic analysis. And how does the emergence of land as property relate to any changes that might have happened to the understanding of territory in Europe? Himanshu, could you please explain a little bit what you mean by that question? That sounds very interesting, but I don't understand fully.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it became clearer to me after I asked it. As an example, the emergence of the nation state as a particular spatial parcel with very clear boundaries is possibly one change that has happened in the way territory, the form that territory takes. And I may be wrong, but I see some kind of parallel in the emergence of private property and the emergence of the nation state. And I'm wondering whether there is some at different levels that holds true. Is there any kind of shared climate, political, economic climate that makes this, that helps both come up?
It is a fantastic question, and I try to respond, but I will limit myself to the German perspective because this is the only territory where I know enough of the legal history. And I would expect that the answer in England or in India is different from what I will say now, but will also have similarities. So the legal history answer would probably start with looking at feudalism and the feudal pyramid. So the idea was that the lord of the land, the king, the duke, was the owner of everything, but gave parcels of land in lien to the knights, to the lower dukes, to the barons, to the farmers. But none of these stakeholders received full property in land, but only something that was closely related to the duties they had to fulfill regarding their lord. That was military duty, so the knights had to go into battle for the lord, and in exchange for that, they received some estate in the wild, and there they could hire peasants to do productive things with the land while they were going to battle for the king. In the course of the 17th and 18th century, this changed. The feudal pyramid became less and less a functioning model, but the cities became more and more important for economic purposes. And there were lots of tensions between the cities and the rural estates. And these tensions, I think, were resolved in time by favoring the city centers and their idea of private property, quite in the way described by Bernoulli. So the top hat symbolizes the capitalist who owns the private land, and the crown symbolizes the rest. Having said that, there is a wonderful description of the initial appropriation in volume 3 of The Capital by Karl Marx. And he put a lot of effort in understanding the legal history of how did capitalist property emerge. What you've been asking takes the discussion one step further. It's not just about property as an instrument of capitalist surplus production, but you ask about property as an as something associated with the national state, the nation state. And I would say that formally that is surely correct. And I'm going back to the international law concept of territorial sovereignty as the prerequisite of creating a civil law system, whereas private stakeholders are assigned property rights in land. But I'm reluctant to take the next step by saying that private property is inherent in the idea of the nation state. I don't think that. Actually, I think that private property sort of exceeds the boundaries of the nation state. If I think about Amazon or Microsoft, they are very good in exploiting their property rights way beyond the nation state. On the other hand, if I think about the intellectual property discussion on COVID-19 medicine, that seems closely related to the nation state. Actually, when the situation was, Joe Biden framed it a little bit like, oh, here are the rich countries in the north with property rights in drugs and vaccines, and there are the poor countries of the global south, and property harms these poor countries. And Angela Merkel strictly rejected that notion, and she said, no, it's not the property right that prevents sub-Saharan Africa from producing COVID-19 vaccines. They don't have the factory capacity. They do not have the experts to produce. Even if they would have the right to do it, they still couldn't do it. This is a very interesting idea that I certainly will continue to think about. But my gut feeling at the moment is that private property sort of exceeds and transgresses the limits of the nation state. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. And just a small comment, and yet private property is also guaranteed in some sense by nation states.
Yes.
So I think that's an interesting list. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, That's really great. So we go to the next question. Sonia, okay.
Sonia has left the building.
Okay.
It's Evangelia again.
Evangelia, once more. Okay. Do you see? Okay. Do you see the naturalistic perception of land, as opposed to the utilitarian, to be more dominant in the following years, due to example of several crises, climate and pandemic, may have an impact? Okay.
Thank you for this question. I think that what became very clear starting in February, March 2020, that the spatial map many of us had in their minds did not conform to what happened in reality. And our perception of spaces has changed dramatically throughout the year 2020, whether it's about planning air travel on the other side of the globe, or the interruption of value chains. We all remember these pictures of the huge tanker lodged in the Suez Canal, and that sort of made the continuing production of goods and services all over the world impossible for a while. And in a way, the problem has not been solved yet. So my first response is yes, but my second response is not so much. I'm probably, like many others, deeply disappointed by the results of the Glasgow meeting. And obviously, many countries are not able to take climate change seriously, and are not willing and able to face the consequences of what scientists are telling us is going to happen. So flooding and wildfires will increase, but it's probably affecting lives more than it will affect policy. Let me give you an example from Germany again. There was this huge flooding in July in Germany in the Ahr. The river Ahr, not a very popular, not a very famous river. Ahr is the Celtic word for water, I have learned. So it was a river with a big name, destroyed many villages and destroyed much property. People died there in summer, flooding. And for 3 months now, people are discussing the rebuilding of these villages. And very little attention is paid to the idea that what we've learned this summer is that many of these houses were built on land that wasn't suitable for development. But I own it. I heard somebody say in one of these public debates, this is my land. Of course I want to rebuild. And you know what happens? The government pays huge sums for this rebuilding. They do not pay huge sums for those people to relocate somewhere safe. No, they really invest into the rebuilding because they fear that otherwise they will lose voters by the droves. It's highly irrational. But Thomas Hartmann, who succeeded me in Dortmund, wrote his PhD on clumsy floodplains, on that interesting irrationality regarding the use of land close to rivers. How has the theory moved from the years that the titling formalization argument has firstly been posed? I haven't heard for quite a while anybody referring to Hernando de Soto, and I haven't read a lot. Actually, may I say that? I have as a reviewer for land use policy, I just saw an article that used Hernando de Soto. So there are people around who are still looking at that, but I believe it has become very clear that title formalization can only solve so and so many problems, but most of the problems just persist, and it's not really something that can be used as effective as Hernando de Soto and the World Bank stipulated. And Evangelia, you raise a third question. What are the boundaries of titling formalization argument? I see it as when the right to a title contest and the right to property. I don't believe that this is the reason why people lost interest in the titling discussion. I think that it turned out that the promise that you can create wealth by title formalization has not been met as effectively as it was promised. I fully believe that the law isn't just an anagram of wealth, but that the law can produce wealth, but only under certain circumstances. And obviously these circumstances are related to formal economies. I hope I have...
Yeah,
yeah,
may I say something? What about the inclusion of secure property rights and the sustainable development goals of the Agenda 2030? I mean, isn't that a kind of confirmation about this titling formalization argument?
It can be considered like that, yes. It definitely. But the thing is, if I remember the 00 years, the De Soto and title formalization were a big thing. That was something when I spoke to NGOs, when I spoke with UN people, when I was looking at journals like Land Use Policy or other journals dealing with land issues, title formalization was really an important issue. And in a way, it has decreased a lot. It's not as important any longer. And if I look at public studies and documents, other things, the green economy, that's a big thing in Europe at the moment. That is something Ursula von der Leyen introduced, and the just city is something that during the second half of 2020, when Germany headed the European Union, they were looking at the just city as the new vision for urban development. And none of these documents is interested in title formalization. So yeah, it's just an empirical thing that I stopped noticing it.
But it is in some parts of the planet. I mean, title formalization was important during 90s, the Central East Europe after the enlargement of the European Union, and also in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and was included at the Washington Consensus List. But yes, being there, I mean, as the indicator 1.4.2 at the Sustainable Development Goals, I think that it still has a kind of position at the agenda, the global agenda about land issues.
Yes, but if you look at the new urban management. How's it called? It's new urban management. That I'm sorry.
Public management.
Yeah, they don't talk about title formalization.
Great. Now we are almost out of time, but Shyam want to ask a question.
Yes.
He is the organizer, so he will have the right to ask
Yeah.
a question. Please.
Thank you, Professor. Once again, on behalf of everyone, for this wonderful talk. We were talking about theoretical considerations about different uses of lands. So how exactly would investment regarding particular areas of land work if we were to assign different uses? Like how do you believe that property rights would work? Because I believe I've read somewhere, I think it was in the book Why Nations Fail, where they had mentioned that investment spurs from a clearly defined property right for a certain particular use. And if we are to have, let's say, different uses for the same piece of land with it's constructed differently, how exactly do you believe that investment could work in such a scenario?
Thank you for that question. I think that if we look at cities and how cities work, we can see very often that different rationalities are effectively shaping and influencing what is going on. And this is, I think, a very elegant way land use practices deal with plural perceptions. It's not that somebody sits there and tries to figure out theoretically what has to be done to align the use of public land in the city and the use of private land in the city, but that in the course of events, these things often seem to organize themselves. And this aspect of self-organization seems to me something that's very difficult for monorational theories to include in what they offer as an explanation of land uses. Does that respond to your question? Did I understand you? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So now I have the opportunity to formally conclude this session. After this, if Ben has time, he would stay for a few more minutes to see if there are some questions for off the record conversation. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Professor Davy. Formally, I should say, for this.
No,
for
you don't call me Ben.
For your time, and you shared your things. Each time I listen to your lecture on polyrationality, land, law, and property rights, I learned something new. So this time also, thank you once more. And for the audience, there will be another session, but we will take a little bit of break. Our next session will be on 2nd of December, when Elizabeth Anderson would be joining us. She would be talking about Protestant work ethics and their application in UK vis-a-vis in India during the British time. So if you have time, please join us on that day. And with that, we are formally concluding. Thank you, Ben. Thank you once more.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun, and I enjoyed the discussion very much.